Kings 3, beginning in verse 16, we read, Then came there 2 women that were harlots unto the king, and stood before him. And the one woman said, O my lord, I and this woman dwell in one house, and I was delivered of a child with her in the house. And it came to pass the 3rd day after that I was delivered, that this woman was delivered also, and we were together. There was no stranger with us in the house, save we 2 in the house. And this woman's child died in the night, because she overlaid it. And she arose at midnight, and took my son from beside me, while thine handmaid slept, and laid it in her bosom, and laid her dead child in my bosom. And when I rose in the morning to give my child suck, behold, it was dead. But when I had considered it in the morning, behold, it was not my son which I did bear. And the other woman said, Nay, but the living is my son, and the dead is thy son. And this said, No, but the dead is thy son, and the living is my son. Thus spake they before the king. Then said the king, The one saith, This is my son that liveth, and thy son is dead. And the other said, Nay, but thy son is the dead, and my son is the living. And the king said, Bring me a sword. And they brought a sword before the king. And the king said, Divide the living child in 2, and give half to the one, and half to the other. Then spake the woman whose the living child was unto the king, for her bowels yearned upon her son, and she said, O my lord, give her the living child, and in no wise slay it. But the other said, Let it be neither mine nor thine, but divide it. Then the king answered and said, Give her the living child, and in no wise slay it. She is the mother thereof. And all Israel heard of the judgment which the king had judged, and they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to do judgment. Now, I believe that this famous episode from the book of 1 Kings can be conclusively shown to be dramatizing an event that did not take place in literal human history among earthly persons, but instead to be clothing in human flesh events that take place in the celestial realms, in the infinite starry heavens over our heads, events we can look up into the night sky to this very day and witness with our own eyes thousands of years after these scriptures were written. What follows is my interpretation of this particular scripture as it relates to the stars. I have seen these patterns in so many other stories in the Old and New Testaments, and in so many of the world's other myths and sacred traditions, that I personally am completely confident and convinced that this interpretation is valid, but I leave it up to each viewer or listener to reach his or her own conclusions. In the night sky, the constellation Virgo plays the leading female role in many myths around the world. Here is the outline of Virgo. Notice her distinctive outstretched arm, marked by the star Vindimiatrix. I believe that the role of at least one of the 2 mothers in the story is played by Virgo. Just above Virgo is her constant companion Boötes, the herdsman, who appears to be seated, and who, I believe, plays the role of Solomon himself in this episode, seated on his throne. Now, Boötes appears to be smoking a pipe, which forks at the end. Very end of it is off the screen here, but this feature is sometimes depicted as an outstretched arm and not a pipe, and with a distinctive hand gesture on that outstretched arm that's reminiscent of this outline of that extended pipe of Boötes. In the passage, we see that Solomon himself is not wielding the sword. He directs someone else and says, Divide the living child in 2. So the swordsman positioned right behind Boötes is the constellation Hercules, who brandishes an upraised sword. It's often depicted as a club, the favored weapon of Hercules, but it also looks like a mighty scimitar, as you can see in this outline of Hercules. And finally, the little living baby who is threatened with the sword is played by the beautiful arc of the northern crown, Corona Borealis, located between Hercules and Boötes. This arc of stars represents the baby arching its back in terror as it is held by the swordsman. Notice that the arm of Hercules normally ends at this star here, but you could easily envision Hercules holding the arch of the northern crown, like a baby, as he is here. So can you envision the story now? Here's the mighty swordsman brandishing his sword as part of the ruse devised by Solomon to determine which of the two is the rightful mother of the baby. What is very interesting to note is that for centuries artists have incorporated the distinctive features of these very constellations when depicting the scene of the judgment of Solomon. In particular, the arch of the baby, identical to the arc of the northern crown, the outstretched arm of one of the two women, and the outstretched arm of Solomon with his hand making that sort of fork at the end with his finger gesture, just like the end of the pipe of Boötes. We will also see that in these paintings, while one woman indicates Virgo by her posture and outstretched arm, the other indicates the opposite zodiac constellation of Pisces, the constellation on the exact opposite side from Virgo, the opposite side of the dome of the stars, the opposite side of the zodiac, and thus the adversary in one sense to Virgo, because it opposes Virgo. It rises when Virgo falls, it falls when Virgo rises. We'll look at several more examples here, see how quickly you can spot the baby arching and dangling from the hand of the swordsman. These paintings make it very clear that the celestial connections of this story were once known very well to somebody, and what's more, that the celestial codes were somehow passed down through the schools of fine art through the centuries. The connections between the constellations in the story should at this point be beyond question. Now, the real question that remains, of course, is the question, what could all this mean? Why would the myths of the world, including the myths found in the Old and New Testaments of the Bible, go to such great lengths to encode the motions of the heavens? And I personally have come to the conclusion that the world's star myths represent an incredible treasure imparted in the distant past to all the different scattered nations of men and women around the globe, designed to convey profound knowledge about the nature of human existence within a universe that's made up of both a visible material realm and an invisible spiritual realm, both of which are interconnected and both of which are present at all times. And it's actually the invisible realm that projects the visible realm, and it's actually the invisible realm that gives life to the visible realm. And we actually have access to the invisible realm at all times, and in this fact, we have access to everything that we actually need. But to the degree that we bite and devour one another over the fear that we won't get enough here in this material realm, we end up destroying ourselves and others. And this is tragic, and it's also ironic, because the material realm is not and never can be the true source of life. And the more we fight over it, thinking that in doing so we'll sustain our own life, the more we turn ourselves into dead physical objects, the ultimate example of which is a corpse, a dead body which has lost the invisible spark of life. And so I believe that's what's being depicted in this story. I believe that the star myths of the world in general use the motions of the stars above to represent the invisible realm, the unseen realm, the world of spirit. Part of the reason that they bring the stars down and clothe them in human form is to say that the events down here, which represent the material realm, are connected to those up there. You see, they're bringing those down here. The world's ancient myths are telling us that these two realms are connected. The material realm is a reflection of the spiritual realm, and by ordering our lives by the motion of the heavenly cycles, we're declaring the truth that we're connected to the invisible world, that we in fact contain the invisible world, that it is part of our lives, and that our motions in this physical realm, this earthly realm, are intimately connected to the invisible realm, to that realm where the Lakota holy man Black Elk called it the real world that is behind this one. In this story, we have depicted for us two mothers, two prostitutes in fact, whom we have seen to be connected to the constellation Virgo and her opposite sign of Pisces. And it's clear that one of these two women is very much depicting blessing and giving life, and the other is depicting cursing and and actually calling for death. For ease of reference, we could even refer to them as the blessing mother and the cursing mother in this particular story. Even after the true mother in the story says, "Give the baby to the other woman, just as long as you don't slay the child," which is presumably what the other one wanted. She wanted to get the baby, right? That's what presumably we thought she came to court for, to try and get the baby. But the cursing mother, even after the true mother says, "Here, you have it," the cursing mother says, "No, cut it in half, divide it, kill it." We see from this she didn't even really want the live baby of the other woman. What she actually wanted was for the live baby of the other woman to become as dead as her own baby. This is the essence of cursing. If blessing, in a sense, can be defined as raising the spirit, bringing forth the invisible inner divine spark in everyone and everything in the universe around us, cursing is doing the opposite. It's beating down the inner divine spark, denying it, even though it's real, trying to actually deny it and erase it, turn everyone and everything into merely material matter with no spiritual or invisible spark inside, and ultimately reducing to death and deadness instead of enlivening and uplifting, which is what we're supposed to be doing. The spiritual truths contained in this story don't stop there. They keep coming for as far as we want to dive further into it. Notice, for example, that the scripture tells us that the two women themselves are prostitutes. That is, they themselves have been objectified, seen as objects, used to fulfill someone else's desire, and one of them apparently has responded by becoming the cursing mother we see in the story, but one of them has responded quite differently. We're all, in fact, objectified or turned into an object in this life to some degree, at the most basic level, of course, by putting on a body in the first place in this incarnate existence. And each of us, to some extent, can probably reflect upon ways in which we have played both of the roles demonstrated by the two mothers in this story. The role of the cursing mother, grasping after the physical as if it will bring us what we want and finding that it gives us nothing but death, and the role of the blessing mother when we begin to awaken to the truth of the invisible world and to nurture the spiritual being, the living baby in the story. One of the lessons of seeing that these stories are not about literal, historical, earthly actors who lived and died thousands of years ago is realizing that they're actually about each and every one of us. When we understand that these stories are star myths and that they're using the motions of the heavens to teach us profound spiritual truths about our own spiritual condition as dual physical and spiritual beings in a dual physical spiritual universe, we can see the truth in Alvin Boyd Kuhn's assertion that, quote, "The Bible is the drama of our history here and now, and it is not apprehended in its full force and applicability until every reader discerns himself or herself to be the central figure in it," end quote. The most obvious central figure in this story, of course, is Solomon himself. We're obviously meant to learn something about the importance of judgment and discernment from this story, and not just human judgment. At the end of the scriptural passage cited above, we see that the people were filled with awe because they saw that the wisdom of God was in Solomon to do judgment. If Alvin Boyd Kuhn is right, however, this is not supposed to fill us with awe regarding some ancient king who had some special wisdom no one else can ever have. Solomon is a picture who is showing us something that we are supposed to have, and thus something that each and every one of us is supposed to have access to. And where do we have access to that wisdom? In the story of Solomon, immediately prior to this passage, in the same 3rd chapter of 1 Kings, there's a passage in which Solomon is visited in a dream by the divine I Am. In that dream, the I Am tells Solomon to ask for a gift, and he asks for judgment, rather than long life or riches or power over his enemies. This answer points to the very same thing that we've been seeing in the message of the blessing mother and the cursing mother. Running after external and material things like long life, riches, or power over one's enemies actually are secondary to the importance of wisdom, judgment, gnosis, and the spiritual, and it tells us something about the source of this discernment. Notice the place where Solomon accesses this wisdom is not a place at all in terms of the material realm. He accesses the wisdom of God in a dream, which is where he is in contact with the divine I Am. He does not have to go anywhere to have access to it. He has access to it right where he is when he lets go of the physical world and contacts the invisible world. I hope that through this brief examination we can all perhaps start to see how this story is warning us from that path of the cursing mother, because it is a spirit-denying path and its outcome can never be fruitful. It cuts itself off from the very source of what it actually needs. But this story also shows us that the source of what we really need is always very close. So close indeed that we actually always have access to it whenever we are ready to do so.